The water off the coast of Alpena, Michigan, looks like every other stretch of Lake Huron. Grey in the morning, restless by the afternoon, cold in a way that settles into your bones even in the middle of July. Nothing about the surface tells you what is resting 100 feet below it. But in the summer of 2009, a research team lowered a camera into that darkness, and what came back on the monitor did not look like anything the lake was supposed to be hiding. Long lines of stone, laid out with intention. Low walls that curved and then narrowed, funneling toward a single point. Structures that someone built, on purpose, on dry ground, at a time when the history most of us were taught says no one on this continent was building anything at all. The people who found it were not hunting for a lost world. They were mapping the lake bottom, dragging sonar back and forth across a submerged ridge that barely appears on any map. And the closer they looked, the stranger it became. These were not random boulders dropped by a retreating glacier and forgotten. I have to pause here for a second. Because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. They were arranged, aligned, set in place by hands that understood the ground they were standing on, in a spot that has been underwater longer than almost every civilization we can put a name to. This is the story of the drowned foundations in Lake Huron, the stonework that sits beneath the waves, older than the shoreline towns, older than the tribes the shoreline remembers, older than the maps, older than the story we tell ourselves about who came first. And the questions it raises are the kind that a lot of people would rather you never think about too hard. To understand why this matters, you have to forget what a lake looks like today. We picture the Great Lakes as permanent, fixed. 5 enormous bowls of fresh water that have always been exactly where they are, holding exactly the water they hold. Children learn them as a shape on a map, a set of names to memorize, a border between two countries, solid, settled, finished. But the lakes are young, and they are restless, and they have not always looked anything like this. 10,000 years ago, as the last great ice sheet pulled back toward the north, the land it uncovered was raw and unfinished. Meltwater pooled and drained and pooled again. Shorelines wandered by miles in a single lifetime. Entire basins filled and emptied over centuries as the ice released its grip and the crushed earth beneath it slowly rose back up. What is now the middle of Lake Huron was, for a long stretch of that time, not lake at all. Geologists have a name for the version of Huron that existed back then. They call it Lake Stanley, and it was a shadow of the lake we know. The water sat far lower than it does today, drained down through outlets that no longer exist, held low by a landscape still bent out of shape by the weight of vanished ice. When a glacier a mile thick sits on a continent for tens of thousands of years, it presses the very crust of the earth downward like a hand pushing into a mattress. When the ice finally melts, the land begins, slowly, to rise back up. That rebound is still happening today, a little more each year. But 9,000 years ago it was far from finished, and the geography it produced was nothing like a map you would recognize. The basin was low, the outlets were open, and straight through the middle of it ran a dry spine of stone that the water had not yet reached. That spine has a name. Running across the basin, from the shore near Alpena on the Michigan side to a point near Amberley on the Ontario side, there is a ridge of limestone. Geologists call it the Alpena-Amberley Ridge. Today it lies drowned beneath as much as 100 feet of cold water, invisible from the surface, ignored by nearly everyone who ever boats above it. But 9,000 years ago, when the lake sat far lower than it does now, that ridge was not underwater. It was a road, a dry land bridge of pale stone and thin tundra stretching more than 100 miles across the heart of the basin, connecting one side of the future lake to the other. Picture it the way it actually was. Not water, but a cold, open corridor. Wind moving over low grass and scattered spruce. A narrow band of walkable ground with deep cold water on either side, running straight through a landscape that was otherwise a maze of marsh and half-formed lake. If you were an animal moving through this country 9,000 years ago, that ridge was the obvious path. The easy path. the only path that truly made sense, and every animal that needed to cross knew it. That is what makes the ridge so important. It was a bottleneck, a funnel built by geology itself. Herds of caribou, migrating with the seasons the way caribou still do in the far north today, would have been squeezed onto that narrow corridor twice a year, pressed into a predictable line by the water on either side. Anything with the patience to wait there, and the knowledge to understand what was coming, would have found the richest hunting ground for hundreds of miles standing right in front of it. And someone did understand it. That is the part that changes everything. The research that pulled this world back into the light was led by an archaeologist named John O'Shea, working with the University of Michigan and a small circle of collaborators. They started with sonar, sweeping the ridge foot by foot, building a picture of a surface no human eye had seen in 9,000 years. Where the sonar showed something that looked deliberate, they sent down remote cameras. Where the cameras found something promising, they sent down divers into water cold enough and deep enough to be genuinely dangerous, to look with human eyes and human hands at what was actually there. There is something genuinely unsettling about diving that ridge, and the people who have done it will tell you so. You descend through green water that fades to grey and then to something close to black, the temperature dropping with every yard, the surface world vanishing behind you. And then the bottom resolves out of the gloom, and it is not the featureless muck you might expect. It is a landscape, a drowned country with its shapes still intact, lines of stone that a person clearly laid, low walls that clearly meant something to someone. You are swimming through a place where people once stood on dry land and made decisions 9,000 years before you arrived to see it, and the sheer wrongness of that, the collision of eras in the cold and the dark, is not something the divers describe lightly. What was there should not have survived. On dry land, 9,000 years of weather, farming, freezing, thawing, and human traffic grind almost everything to dust. But the lake had done something rare. When the water rose and swallowed the ridge, it sealed it. No ploughs ever crossed it. No cities were ever built on top of it. No frost heaved it apart winter after winter. The cold, still, dark water simply held it in place, like a room closed off and forgotten, exactly as it had been on the day the water came in. And what the water had been keeping was architecture. Not a single wall, but a system. The team documented long lines of stones arranged into what archaeologists call drive lanes. Low walls, sometimes running straight for dozens of yards, sometimes bending on purpose, designed to guide moving animals along a chosen path and toward a chosen place. They found V-shaped structures with the open end facing the direction the caribou would have come from, and the narrow end pointing exactly where a hunter would want the animals to end up. They found hunting blinds, circles and enclosures of piled stone just large enough to hide a person crouched and waiting, positioned precisely where an ambush would work best. One structure in particular, a complex the team labelled Drop 45, stopped people in their tracks. It was not a simple line. It was a considered piece of work, with lanes approaching from more than one direction, blinds set at the points of maximum advantage, the whole thing arranged with an understanding of movement and sight lachins that would not embarrass a modern engineer. This was not a lucky pile of rocks. This was a plan, executed in stone, by people who knew exactly what they were doing and exactly why. But the stones alone, however suggestive, are not quite proof on their own. A skeptic could always argue that nature arranges rocks in strange ways, that our eyes invent order in the dark because we want it to be there. What settled the question was something far smaller than any wall. Down among the structures, the team recovered chipped stone, flakes of rock knocked loose in the making and sharpening of tools, the unmistakable litter of human hands at work. Stone does not chip itself into those shapes. Waves do not scatter that particular kind of debris. Those small, sharp scraps were the fingerprints of people, lying exactly where the walls said people should have been, confirming beyond any reasonable argument that living men and women had knelt on that ground, worked their tools, and waited there for the herds to come. The ridge was not a trick of the light or a quirk of geology. It was a place where people lived. And that single small truth is what makes everything about this ridge impossible to ignore. Picture the day it worked. Autumn, the light going flat and cold, the caribou moving south the way instinct told them to. They step onto the ridge because the ridge is the only dry ground, and the water on either side does precisely what the builders knew it would. It presses the herd into a line. Ahead, low walls of stone rise out of the grass, not tall, not obvious, just enough to feel like a boundary to an animal that trusts the path of least resistance. The caribou follow the lanes without alarm. They never see the shapes of people folded down inside the blinds, waiting, breath held, positioned at the exact points where the lanes pinch tightest and the animals have nowhere left to turn. It is not luck. It is not chaos. It is a machine made of stone and patience and knowledge passed down long enough to be built into the ground itself. And it worked, season after season, for generations, on a plain that no longer exists. Caribou are creatures of ferocious habit, and that is the whole secret of why this could work at all. They follow the same migration routes their ancestors followed, year after year, generation after generation, moving between summer and winter ranges along corridors that can stay fixed for thousands of years. That predictability is exactly what made the ridge such a prize. This was not a single lucky ambush. It was a resource you could count on, a rhythm you could build a life around. The people who raised those stones were not reacting to chance. They were investing in the future, laying down walls that would pay them back every spring and every autumn, betting that the herds would keep coming the way herds always had. And for a very long time, they were right. What makes those drive lanes stranger still is that the same basic idea shows up all over the planet. From the deserts of the Middle East to the open plains of North America, ancient peoples built long stone lines to funnel animals toward a kill. Some of these structures are enormous, stretching for miles, so vast that their full shape only becomes clear from the air. Different continents, different animals, different thousands of years, and yet the same fundamental design, the same understanding of how to turn a landscape into a trap. To the cautious mind, that is simple convergence. Clever people solving the same problem the same sensible way. To a more restless mind, it starts to look like a shared inheritance, a way of thinking about land and stone that was somehow common to peoples we are told never met. Now sit with the age of it for a moment. These structures are around 9,000 years old. That is not a rounding off of a few centuries. That is older than the pyramids of Egypt by roughly 4,000 years, older than Stonehenge, older than the first cities of Mesopotamia, older than writing, older than the wheel, older than nearly every date the standard timeline hands you when it wants to describe the beginning of organized human effort. While the textbooks were still telling us these early people were scattered, simple, and small, someone was engineering a landscape at the bottom of what would one day become one of the largest bodies of fresh water on Earth. To feel the real weight of that date, put the ridge next to what the rest of the world was doing 9,000 years ago. There were no pharaohs, there was no Egypt. Sumer, the civilization we are usually told started it all, would not exist for thousands of years yet. The first walls of Jericho had been raised, and in a scattering of places, people were only just beginning to experiment with planting seeds instead of chasing herds. This was the deep dawn of the settled world. And here, in the cold middle of a future lake in North America, people were reading a migration corridor with such precision that they engineered it into a permanent machine for feeding themselves. They were not primitive, and they were not stumbling. They were deliberate. But the water was coming back. The same rebound that had drained the basin low was also, elsewhere, closing off old outlets and forcing the lake to climb. It did not happen in a single afternoon. There was no wall of water, no dramatic flood to run from. The lake crept up over centuries, a little higher each generation, the dry margins shrinking so slowly that no single person would ever have watched their world end. The grass went to marsh. The marsh went to shallows. The shallows went to open lake. And one year, without ceremony or witness, the last of the ridge slipped beneath the surface, the drive lanes and the blinds fell silent under the cold, and the corridor that had fed people for thousands of years became nothing more than a shape on the bottom of a lake, waiting 9,000 years for anyone to notice it had ever been anything else. And here is the turn that the title of this story promised you. Every culture that lives on the shore of Lake Huron today arrived after this. The tribes whose names are carried by the rivers and the counties. The French and the British who fought over the fur trade, the lumber towns, the shipping lanes, the lakeside cottages, the cities with their harbour lights. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. All of it, every last piece of the human story the shoreline remembers, came later. The foundations under the water were already ancient, already drowned, already forgotten, before any of the cultures we associate with these lakes ever set foot on the beach. The shoreline does not remember the builders. The shoreline never met them. Now, the careful version of this story ends about there. It says these were early hunter-gatherers, far more organized than we ever gave them credit for, who read a natural corridor with real genius, and were then erased from memory by rising water. That is the version you will find in the journals, and it is remarkable enough standing on its own. But it also opens a door that is very hard to close once you have seen through it. Because if a landscape this important could sit hidden under 100 feet of water for 9,000 years, unknown to everyone, unmapped and unremembered until a sonar beam happened to catch it, then the obvious question is simple, and it is uncomfortable. What else is down there? Think about how the discovery actually happened. No one went out looking for a lost world. It was found almost by accident, as a side effect of mapping the lake floor for entirely different reasons. The structures were not hidden by any person. They were hidden by the water, by our own certainty that there was nothing worth finding. For most of modern history, the assumption was that the deep basins of the Great Lakes were empty, geologically interesting perhaps, but archaeologically blank. The ridge was drowned, and drowned things were considered gone, so no one looked. And because no one looked, an entire chapter of the human past sat 100 feet under the surface, complete and waiting, while the world above argued about who the first people here really were. There is a quiet arrogance in the way we decide where to look. We search where it is easy, we dig where it is dry and near a road and already famous, and then we mistake the shape of our own convenience for the shape of the past. The deep water of the Great Lakes was never convenient, so it was never searched, so it was declared empty, and the declaration hardened into fact simply because no one had the reason or the equipment to challenge it. The ridge did not give up its secret because we finally grew wiser. It gave it up because the technology to see the lake floor finally caught up with a question that almost no one had bothered to ask. Convenience, not curiosity, has quietly drawn the borders of nearly everything we think we know about the deep past. That should make you wonder about the rest of the planet, because the ridge in Lake Huron is far from the only place where the map used to be different. When the last ice age ended, sea levels around the world rose by more than 300 feet. Coastlines that people had lived on for thousands of years vanished under the ocean. Entire regions that were once dry, walkable, inhabited land are now seabed. In the North Sea, between Britain and mainland Europe, there was a country dry enough to walk across, with rivers and hills and hunting grounds and people, that scientists now call Doggerland. It is gone, drowned, and it is only one of many. All around the world, the places where early humans would most naturally have gathered, the low coasts and the river mouths and the land bridges, are exactly the places the rising water took first. And Doggerland is only the beginning of that list. Off the coast of Southeast Asia lies Sunderland, an entire drowned subcontinent where dry plains once joined islands that are now separated by open sea. A vast basin beneath what is today the Persian Gulf may have been green and watered when the deserts around it were harsh, a refuge people could have gathered in for generations before the water poured in over the top of it. The floor of the Black Sea still holds old shorelines from when it was a smaller freshwater lake, before the Mediterranean broke through and raised it. Beringia, the land bridge that carried the first Americans across from Asia, now lies split apart beneath the Bering Strait. Over and over, the same story repeats. Land that people used, land that people needed, swallowed by water and struck from the record, not because it was unimportant, but simply because it was low. So consider what that actually means when you line it up. The most desirable land, the land nearest the water, the land where people would have built and hunted and gathered in the greatest numbers, is precisely the land that is now underwater and almost never searched. We have written the story of early humanity almost entirely from the evidence that happened to stay dry. And then we have called that partial story the whole story, as if the drowned portions of the map never held anything at all. The foundations in Lake Huron are proof, sitting right there in the cold, that this assumption is wrong. That real structure, real planning, real human intelligence was operating in these lost places and simply got swallowed. This is where the deeper questions begin to press in. If the standard timeline could miss something this large, this organized, this old, sitting in a lake in the middle of a well-mapped continent, then how much confidence should we really place in the timeline itself? How many other foundations are down there in the dark, on ridges no one has thought to scan, in basins written off long ago as empty? And when we finally do look, will the story we have been told about who built what and when, and how advanced they were permitted to be, survive contact with what the water has been quietly keeping? And there is a particular kind of assumption the ridge quietly dismantles. We are used to a tidy story about how human economies grew up. First, the wandering bands, scraping hand to mouth, taking only what the day happened to offer. Then, much later, the farms, the surplus, the planning, the settled ownership of a productive place. The ridge does not fit that clean staircase. Building drive lanes and blinds, and maintaining them across generations, is not hand-to-mouth survival. It is capital. It is infrastructure. It is a group of people spending labour now to secure a predictable return later, defending and handing down a productive asset, organising themselves around a resource they did not simply stumble upon but engineered. That is economic behaviour we are usually taught arrived thousands of years afterward, with agriculture and the first towns. Yet here it is, written in cold stone at the bottom of a lake, long before the accepted story says any of it should exist. There are people who look at all of this and see more than a clever hunting ground. They see a pattern that runs deeper than one ridge. Drowned stonework here. A vanished country in the North Sea. Submerged structures reported off coasts on nearly every continent, some accepted without argument, others fiercely disputed. To them it starts to look less like a scatter of unrelated accidents and more like the faint outline of something the official history was never built to explain. A world that was older, wider, and more connected than we are comfortable admitting. A human story that did not begin where the textbook says it did, and did not climb the neat, tidy, upward line we were handed in a classroom. Now, it would be easy, and it would be dishonest, to pretend the mainstream has no answer to any of this. It does. The careful reply is that similar problems tend to produce similar solutions. That people all over the world, facing the same cold, the same stone, the same migrating animals, arrived independently at the same practical ideas, and that this resemblance is convergence rather than some secret shared origin. It is a fair point, and an honest telling has to include it. But even taken at its most cautious, that answer does not shrink the mystery under Lake Huron. It only sharpens it, because it still concedes the central, staggering fact that the drowned world was real, that it was inhabited, that it was shaped by human hands with skill and intent, and that we lost it so completely we did not even know to go looking. There is another detail that lingers long after the rest. The team that studied the ridge has only ever examined a fraction of it. The Alpina Amberley Ridge runs for more than 100 miles across the lake bottom. The structures that made the headlines came from a small handful of surveyed sites strung out along that enormous length. The rest of it, mile after mile of drowned corridor where caribou once funneled and hunters once waited in the stone, remains almost completely unexamined. Not because there is nothing there, because the water is deep, the diving is slow and dangerous, the funding is thin, and the surface above it looks, to anyone passing over in a boat, like nothing at all. It is worth pausing on how nearly this was never known at all. The preservation that makes the ridge so extraordinary is the same thing that kept it invisible. Had the structures been on land, they would have been found centuries ago, and very likely destroyed in the finding, ploughed under or quarried away to build other walls. Because they were drowned, they survived perfectly. And because they were drowned, no one knew to look. The very thing that protected the evidence also hid it. That is a strange kind of luck, and it should make you cautious about the word never. Every time someone tells you early people never did this, or that a lost world never existed here, remember that for 9,000 years the confident answer about this ridge would have been exactly the same, and it would have been wrong. So the foundations we know about are almost certainly not all the foundations there are. They are the small, lit corner of a room that is mostly still in darkness. Every reason the first structures were missed for 9,000 years still applies, right now, to everything the divers have not yet reached. And that may be the most unsettling thought this whole story leaves you holding. Not the stone we have found, but the far larger amount we almost certainly have not, sitting patiently in the cold, waiting for a beam of sonar or a curious camera to finally admit that it is there. And it is not only Huron. Every one of the Great Lakes stood lower once. Every one of them holds deep basins and drowned ridges that were dry ground when the ice was still in retreat and the first people were already here. Michigan, Superior, the cold, deep water that no diver visits without a very good reason. If the corridor under Huron was found by accident, on a ridge that no one expected to matter, then the honest thing to admit is that we have barely begun to search the rest. Thousands of square miles of former dry land sit under those lakes, unmapped in any real detail, unexamined and unremembered. We called them empty because we never looked, and we now have one very good reason to suspect that word was only ever a guess. Try to hold the builders in your mind for a second, because the record gives us almost nothing else of them. No faces, no names, no graves we can point to, and no language we can read. All they left is the stone, and the intelligence written into how it was placed. They knew the herds, they knew the wind and the water, and the turning of the season. They knew how an animal thinks when it is funneled, and where a person should hide, and how to shape a piece of open ground so that it would keep giving for lifetimes. Whoever they were not the huddled, helpless ancestors from the cartoon version of prehistory. They were engineers of a wilderness that no longer exists, and the lake is the only thing left that remembers them. The lake does not care about our timelines. It does not care which culture we decided came first, or which dates we underlined in the textbook, or how confident the experts sounded when they drew the line between prehistory and history. It simply holds what it holds. 9,000 years ago, a corridor of pale stone ran across a cold open plain, and people who left behind no name and no monument on the surface built something careful and lasting upon it. Then the water rose, quietly, over generations, and closed the door. And for 9,000 years, until a research vessel happened to drift over exactly the right patch of darkness, the only witness to what those people had done was the lake itself. We tend to believe that the past is settled, that the big questions of who we are and where we came from were answered long ago, sealed in books, safe on shelves. But the foundations in Lake Huron are a reminder that the past is not settled at all. It is submerged. Most of it is still down there, in the drowned coasts and the flooded corridors and the dark basins we have never once bothered to search, older than the shoreline, older than the story, waiting in the cold for someone patient enough and curious enough to finally look. And when they do, when someone at last maps the whole of that ridge, and then the next lake, and then the drowned coasts beyond them, we may discover that the oldest chapter of our story was never truly lost at all. It was only underwater, exactly where we chose not to look, patient as the stone, older than the shoreline, waiting the entire time for us to be ready to see it.